bike path that I normally run on is packed right now with snow and ice, which makes running on it fairly treacherous. So lately, I've been running indoors on a treadmill, which is definitely not my first choice. However, there's something about running in the dead of winter when it's really cold out and working up a good sweat that's sort of nice. So the other day, I finished up my run on the treadmill and I headed upstairs to clean up. And I noticed all these, white streaks caked across my face. It's salt, right? We know this. And I see this a lot in the summertime when it's more humid out, but not so often in the winter. But there it was, sort of seeping out of the pores of my skin, serving as a gritty reminder that we are salt. And I sort of laughed to myself because I read the gospel already, and I sort of laughed to myself and thought, yeah, Jesus, you're always right about these things. And personally, I'd rather be sugar or something that gets a little bit more thunder. But we're not. And my salty skin reminded me of that. The timing could not have been better. Because it reminded me that even when we forget or we don't realize that we're salt, we still are. Because I think many times what we do when we hear this passage, this is one that we hear a lot, right? Many times when we read this passage, it says, if salt loses its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? And I think we hear that either we are salt or we are not salt. It's one or the other. Like we get to pick which one. And I don't think that's right. Because did you know that it's just about impossible to destroy salt? It's like if you go to the beach or if you have a sore throat, you mix the salt in with the water, and you can't see the salt, but as soon as it touches your lips, you know it's there. Salt is incredibly enduring. And also, I looked up to see, is it possible to melt it down? And you can melt salt, but even at 1,472 degrees Fahrenheit, it still retains its chemical composition. So I believe that it's the fact that salt endures that Christ drew this comparison between us and salt. So maybe a better reading of those words would be, if the salt loses its taste or enduring qualities, which it never does, then it would be good for nothing. But you are salt, so you are good for many things. So since we are salt, what does that mean? And I'm probably going to tell you a bunch of things that you know. But I think Jesus was probably saying to his disciples things that they knew too and needed to be reminded of. So salt, the qualities of salt are flavor, right? A little bit goes just a long way. And this week I was making cookies. And you add salt always to these dessert recipes. And I've always assumed that the reason that you add salt to dessert recipes had something to do with the baking soda and the salt combination. That was my assumption. They follow after one another in a recipe. It just made sense in my head. But since I was on this salt kick, I decided to look it up and find out really why is it that I'm supposed to add salt to my cookies. Well, it turns out that adding salt to things intensifies the flavor of whatever it's added to. So salt makes as my kids call them, my world-famous chocolate chip cookies, salt makes them taste more like they are supposed to taste. And another quality of salt is preservation, right? We know this just for how long a ham can last in our refrigerators. And we also know that animals will travel long distances just to lick some salt, which in that case it might be life preservation, which I think leads us to another quality of salt, which is healing. Salt has some antibacterial agents in it, so salt heals. And for all the bad rap that salt gets, like in our diets, we do need it, or else we'll die. And the last one that we cannot possibly forget as we're digging out from all this snow and ice is that it penetrates. After these snowy weeks, we've all seen what rock salt can do. And if rock salt can melt that much, imagine what us as salt can do. I envision that Jesus thinks that we can help him melt hearts of stone. So salt, it flavors, it penetrates, it preserves, it melts, and it heals. So we as salt, we flavor and preserve and penetrate and melt and heal. A college friend of mine's husband is from Egypt, and he returned just 3 days before all the uprising. So she sends me lots of information on the crisis over there, and some of it is stuff that we hear in the media, and some of it is more on a personal nature, like, from his family's perspective and those types of things. If you're on Facebook at all, you may have seen the photo that I put up there. It's a photo that I got from her. And it is of young Coptic Christians dressed in their regular old garb, their cool leather jackets and their jeans. And they are forming a ring, grasping hands and forming a ring around Muslims during Egypt at their daily prayer time. And while this is all going on, like surrounding them, are the lights and the buildings and the chaos and all the looting is going on around them as this ring is formed. And as you look at the picture, you can see like smiles on some people's faces, and you can see concern on other people's faces, and heads just bowed in prayer. And when I look at that picture, it reminds me of being salt. Because these Christians, they stood there protecting their Muslim brothers. Preservation. And they chose to add themselves to this story so that the Muslims could be who they are. Flavor. And honestly, the Christians, in doing that, were more authentically who they are too. Melting hearts with their steadfast expression of God's love and penetrating the chaos of that moment by just holding hands with one another. And I believe that just sometimes seeing those types of pictures, just knowing that those types of things actually go on when we see just chaos around us, that there's immeasurable healing that comes from things like that. Salt is not useful unto itself. That's one thing we see. Salt never stands alone. Its usefulness becomes evident when it's added to something else. So I think sort of what Jesus is saying to us is when we're being salty, we are being as fully human as we possibly can be. And that's a good thing, because in the Bible it says that God made humans just a little lower than angels. Than angels, which means we're precious to God. And that's the last thing about salt that I haven't mentioned, that salt is precious. I think think today we take salt for granted. But when Jesus spoke these words, he was aware of it. He was aware that people's wages were even paid in salt. I think that sometimes we have a hard time believing that we are good, that we are worthy, that we are lovable, that we are precious. So I think maybe when Jesus calls us salt, we're apt to kind of nod our heads and say, yeah, we are, thanks. So this week, I need your help. Because I think it will help us to remember and realize that we are salt. Because it's one thing for you to hear it here, but it's a whole nother thing for you to hear it out there. So this week, if you would keep your eyes open, and when you see someone acting as salt, don't say thank you. And don't say good job. Say, you are salt. Or write it in a note. Or send it in an email. Or add it to the Epiphany Facebook page. I have a thing that says, where do you see salt in the world? I would love to have a bunch of comments of where salt happens in the world. Because I bet if you say that, it will stop that person in their tracks. I bet they'll hear it differently than they've ever heard it before. And I bet they'll remember it. And I bet they'll hear in a different way that they are precious to Jesus and to the world. And I think if they hear that, then they're also more likely to be more salty more often. Jesus' words to us today are meant to remind us exactly what we are and whose we are. The living presence of God. So I know it's going to feel a little odd telling somebody that they're salty. But maybe if you remember how it feels right now, when Jesus says to you, you are salt, you'd like it, wouldn't you? And it might just remind you not only what you are, but also whose you are.